You're not completely taking away your right to have ice cream. For this to work, you need to understand three things. Now, here is a tiny point of disagreement that I have with the book Tiny Habits. Resolutions generally fall into two categories: achievement goals, which are one-time events like going to the Grand Canyon, and habit goals, which are things like going to the gym more often, eating healthier, or being more consistent on YouTube. Habits can be a challenge to build, and as a psychologist, many of my clients struggle with making or breaking new behavioral patterns. So let's explore the science-based strategies for habit formation. In discussions of habit formation, many people cite Charles Duhigg's book, The Power of Habit. Just a note here on Charles Duhigg and other popular authors. Many authors aren't behavioral scientists themselves, but rather talented journalists and nonfiction authors who are able to take complex scientific studies and weave them into a cohesive narrative with actionable recommendations. In his book, The Power of Habit, Charles Duhigg describes the cue, habit, reward loop, otherwise known as the habit loop. The habit loop is based on scientific studies in the area of behavioral research, neuroscience, and even the area of industrial organizational psychology, which investigates how to optimize employee performance as well as customer behaviors. Let's get into the specifics of this loop. Knowing the specifics of this loop, as well as ways that things can go wrong, can help explain why habits fail. Let's look at the cue. The cue is a trigger which initiates a behavior or routine. Cues can be anything: an external event, an emotion, a location, or even a time of day. These cues get linked to the behavior that happens right after the cue. If we want to go old school psychology, it's similar to the conditioning studies and Pavlov's dogs. Many of these cues start off as a neutral stimuli, but over time they get linked over and over again with a specific behavior, creating the habit or the routine. Habits are a special type of behavior on a neurochemical level because your habits are automatic responses that have become associated with a cue through repetition. This concept of almost automatic behavior, or behavior that seems easier to do after a specific cue, was actually first hypothesized way back in the 1940s, when Canadian psychologist Donald Hebb proposed that neurons that fire together wire together. So the more that two neurons are activated together, that synaptic connection between them was strengthened. Like when you do something, every time you go somewhere, the stronger the connection between the neurons. Decades later, functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, has supported his hypothesis. fMRIs measure changes in blood flow and oxygenation, providing a measure of neural activity. Researchers use fMRI to identify different regions that are active during specific tasks or experiences. Those patterns of neural activation help scientists identify regions where neurons are likely firing together. Studies have found that the basal ganglia, a group of nuclei located deep in the brain, plays a critical role in habit formation by forming associations between environmental cues and specific behavioral responses. The basal ganglia is also part of a brain loop connected to your frontal cortex, which is the part of the brain involved in decision-making and goal-directed behavior. So as habits become more ingrained, there's a shift from goal-directed behavior controlled by the prefrontal cortex and more automatic habitual behavior controlled by the basal ganglia. So this means that over time, it takes little to no decision-making or brain power to engage in those habitual behaviors. Your actions become almost automatic. Finally, there's the reward part of the loop. The reward is the positive outcome that follows the completion of the habit. That sense of pleasure that's reinforcing on a behavioral and neurochemical level closes out the reward part of this habit loop. On a basic behavioral level, humans tend to do things that bring them joy or feel good, which is positive reinforcement. We also tend to do things that remove something uncomfortable or stop discomfort. That's called negative reinforcement. Sometimes things are mixed or combined reinforcement, and those loops are particularly difficult to break. For example, if you're hungry, you might be feeling a little bit of a discomfort, and that unpleasant feeling in your stomach is your cue to go get something to eat. You get up to go to the fridge and you eat something, that's the habit. Now, the reward here comes from both positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. First, it feels good to eat. We're biologically programmed to get little hits of dopamine and pleasure from eating foods, especially foods that are high in sugar, fat, or salt. But there's also a negative reinforcement, the removal of the feeling of discomfort and the satisfaction that you get from meeting a desire. The basal ganglia, which is that brain region that we discussed as being vital to this habit loop formation, is also where dopamine-producing neurons are located. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter or a chemical messenger, which I refer to on this channel as the feel-good brain juice because of its association with pleasure and reward. Dopamine is released in response to rewarding or pleasurable experiences, increasing the likelihood that the associated behavior will be repeated. So how can the system work for or against your habit formation? Let's start by focusing on the cue portion of this loop and why this portion could make or break your habit goals. In his book Atomic Habits, James Clear, a nonfiction writer and current motivational speaker, pointed out a very important part of this cue situation. See, cues are not a single thing, but they exist within a larger environment. Like, if the cue waking up was the same, you would respond the same way waking up in your own bed on a Saturday afternoon or waking up on a cot out in a field doing human performance research studies with the Army. The cue is the same, waking up, but the environment can trigger a vastly different response. The author suggests that one way to impact the cue part of this loop is to modify your environment so that it's obvious or easy for you to engage in the behavior that you'd like to see more of, and that it's harder for you to engage in the behavior that you want to do less of. This is great for situations where you can control key parts of your environment. But one issue some of my clients have in attempting to change the cues within their environment is the lack of control that they have about key portions of that environment. If your inability to change key parts of your environment is getting in the way of your habit formation, consider behavioral substitution. Behavioral substitution refers to the process of replacing one behavior with another in order to satisfy a similar need. That satisfaction becomes the reward in the habit loop. For this to work, you need to understand three things. First, what is the unwanted behavior and when is it likely to happen? Second, what is the underlying need that's being fulfilled by that behavior? Third, what is an alternative behavior that might meet a similar need? If you've seen some of my other videos, this might sound a lot like implementation intention, where you develop if-then statements for future situations that you anticipate might get in the way of your habit goals. But this concept has also been integrated into health behavior interventions. For example, I worked with the Veterans Administration in decreasing smoking behaviors for veterans that attended day programs within their hospitals. A lot of their smoking cues were the same whenever there was a break in the day program or they were moving from one class to another. There wasn't much that they could do to change the environment to minimize those cues because they were in a pretty structured day program, which required the clinicians or the therapists or the doctors to take those 5-minute breaks, and they needed to move from one portion of the hospital to the other. But there was a wide variety of needs that were being met by these smoke breaks. Some people just needed a 5-minute break from being in the hospital, while others used that time to socialize and make new connections. By understanding the needs that were being met by the maladaptive behavior, we were able to identify some behavioral substitutions that could meet similar needs. This included having a designated break room where people could go in and check their phones in a quiet space, as well as a room for socialization with games or other activities to foster those connections. All right, let's switch over to the habit part of the habit loop and how things could go right or wrong in this section. Ben Bergeron, husband in my head and respected coach to some of the fittest people on earth, so says CrossFit, is constantly discussing doing the wrong thing or the thing that you don't want to do. There's no right or wrong here. But back to Ben. There is good scientific evidence that supports breaking the connection between the cue and the habit by making the habit harder to do is an effective way to stop bad habits. On the other hand, making it obvious and easy for you to do the behavior that you'd like to do more of has also been found to be efficacious. Let's look at two examples, one in the world of personal behavior, and then let's look at how businesses use this to their advantage. Common recommendations from dietitians working with individuals trying to change their eating habits explained the importance of clearing out food that you don't want to eat from your cupboards and your refrigerator. This makes it harder for you to engage in the habit that you're trying to stop. You're not completely taking away your right to have ice cream, you're just making it a little bit harder. If you really want that ice cream, get in the car and head out to the grocery store. That level of effort will decrease the likelihood that you'll eat that ice cream, and it's also creating some space between the cue, be it the environment, your desire, your emotional state, and that habit. Putting some distance between the cue and the habit helps to break that cue-habit loop. This could also function the other way. When things are easy for you to do, it increases the likelihood that the cue and the behavior or the habit will be linked, and that will strengthen the habit loop. Businesses and hospitals have integrated these concepts into their operations. Amazon is a great example of decreasing friction or making it super easy for you to make a purchase. Your credit card information is automatically stored, and all you have to do is click a button, making it super easy for you to make the purchase. Just like Amazon makes it super easy for you to make a purchase, you could make it super difficult for yourself to make a purchase by removing your credit card information from auto-saving within the website. I did something similar as a behavioral consultant for a hospital a few years ago. We simply made it harder for physicians to prescribe this particular medication. We literally added a scroll and 2 clicks, and prescription rates decreased from 47% of inpatients down to 6% of inpatients being prescribed this medication over a 12-month period. You can use the same strategies at home, either making it really hard for you to do the things that you're trying to do less of, or making it super easy for yourself to do the things that you want to do more of. One of the ways that YouTube makes it super easy for you to subscribe to this channel is that it has the button linked right there, right below. All you have to do is give it a little tap, and you're subscribed. Every time I see the number of subscribers increase, or I see the little like button was hit in my video, it gives me a little hit of dopamine and works within the reward system of this habit loop. We've already spoken a little bit about the neuroscience of the reward and pleasure system, so let's shift to the behavioral portion of the reward and how you may not be using the reinforcement system to your advantage. Success breeds success through the development of self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is the evidence-based belief in your ability to engage in new behaviors and sustain your new habit. The more you do it, the more confident you are in your ability to do it, and the more likely you are to do it again. In his book, Tiny Habits, BJ Fogg, actual behavioral scientist and director of the Behavior Design Lab at Stanford University, describes the importance of building ability through the use of tiny habits. The thesis of the book is that starting with tiny habits allows individuals to experience success quickly, and each successful completion of a tiny habit contributes to a sense of achievement, boosting self-efficacy. So by focusing on small incremental changes and celebrating small wins, you become your own reinforcement and reward. One of the best science-backed ways to develop your own habit-based reinforcement system is to attach a new habit to an already existing, well-established habit. This concept has been discussed in multiple ways across multiple self-help books. James Clear explains it as habit stacking, but I'd like to discuss it from the scientifically supported notion of behavioral chaining. Behavioral chaining is the act of attaching a new habit to a well-established habit. The reason I like to discuss it from a behavioral chaining perspective rather than a general habit stacking is because the new habit should make sense within the context of the already existing routine or habit. It's hard to task switch, so it's important to attach the new habit to a similar habit, or something that might be a natural extension to the already existing habit. For example, if you want to drink more water and you already have a well-established workout habit, you can attach drinking a full water canteen to the end of your workouts. You're already a little thirsty, you're generally near a water source. This is a perfect opportunity to link a new habit to an already existing habit. Now, here is a tiny point of disagreement that I have with the book Tiny Habits. Tiny habits do allow you to have quick successes, but you run the risk of losing motivation or not being able to stick to a habit that's too small. New habits need to be big enough to mean something to you. A little bit of effort could even be better for you in developing confidence. Sometimes habits need to be a little bit bigger or harder to better align with your values. Aligning your new habits with your values might increase the likelihood that you'll stick to those new habits. Moreover, acting consistent with your values can have an overall impact on your happiness and well-being. But sometimes it could be hard to figure out what your values are, which is why I made this video right here, which walks you through a step-by-step process for figuring out your values.